Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. After several weeks of Vladimir Putin attacking the Ukraine, there are several poignant moments where President Zelenskyy of the Ukraine has shown his bravery and shown his people's bravery as they stand up to the bullying and the destruction of their country by the Russians and Vladimir Putin. Last week, as President Zelenskyy appeared in front of the Canadian Parliament, he made a simple statement: close the skies. Meaning, find no-fly zones so that the Russians couldn't attack civilians, and to cut off the Russian planes from being able to bomb civilian sites. The Polish government has promised to send planes to the Ukraine for them to use in an attempt to slow down the bombings and help the Ukrainians gain a stronger foothold against the Russian attacks. So we're going to listen to the members of Parliament as they react to what President Zelenskyy had to say, and they're going to give brief statements about what they heard in this next particular segment. And we're going to hear more about Vladimir Putin made a warning to those he considers to be scum and traitors. He's made several threats and issued several warnings to Western governments about trying to help the Ukraine and stop the war that's going on and end the destruction and the killings of innocent civilians and the attacks on civilian sites. So let's listen to this next segment and enjoy the program as we play other things that happened last week between Russia and Ukraine as the fighting continues. Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Well, this whole ordeal has been this whole ordeal has been very emotional. I think for those of us of Ukrainian heritage, but for all Canadians and definitely as parliamentarians. So to have President Zelenskyy actually appear and address Parliament today, and the way he described, how we should put ourselves in his shoes, or what Ukrainians are experiencing with, buildings being bombed and, memorial sites being bombed and women and children being killed. I think that makes it real. And also that gives us that sense of urgency that we need to do more.
Can you talk a bit more about, your leader's suggestion to get a no-fly zone over the humanitarian corridor, I guess?
I'll get to that.
Well, that was my question.
That was your question? Okay.
Yeah, I'm just curious about this she talked about, for the first time it seems, about a no-fly zone over Ukraine.
So Ukraine's been calling for this for a long time. And so, listening today and knowing that President Zelenskyy needs this type of support, and more importantly, the people that are trying to escape and the humanitarian aid that's trying to get into cities like Kharkiv, like Mariupol, like Kiev, there needs to be a concerted effort by our partners and allies to provide that safe space and protect that zone so that those convoys of people and supplies and humanitarian relief can travel.
But your understanding is that this is a humanitarian corridor?
Yes, definitely. This would be and this has been suggested, is to establish humanitarian corridors and no flying over those corridors so people and humanitarian relief can flow both directions.
But aren't you scared that this could provoke Russia? Because the big fear, the NATO leaders have said that, are fearing with those kind of having a no-fly zone over Ukraine is that basically if there's a Russian flight, coming, we're going to have to shoot it down, and that could lead us into World War III.
So, there is, under the United Nations, the responsibility to protect. Russia is a signatory to the responsibility to protect. And so this is about protecting the civilians. It's not about influencing a war zone. It's about making sure civilians are not being targeted. It's to make sure people can traverse out and become refugees if that's what they choose to do. And it's about making sure that relief efforts are actually getting to the people that decided to stay and are unable to get out of their communities.
Isn't that, though, is Canada, is the Conservative Party the only party to suggest that? I haven't seen other countries or allies suggest that.
I think there's been talk from other countries of establishing, these humanitarian corridors, and it has been suggested by President Zelenskyy. So we are saying that we're standing united with Ukraine, that we are standing shoulder to shoulder. Should we not step up and help them establish these corridors for humanitarian relief?
Yes, but the no-fly zone over the corridor.
Well, that's I know there's going to be a concern, but we expect that Russia will want to respect that establishment to get people to safety, so that they're not unfairly harmed and collateral damage in this escalation that we're experiencing right now.
So that would mean Canadian troops enforcing the no-fly zone, right?
So, I'll say this, because the government of Canada has done such a poor job of addressing our military, we're flying around with fighter jets that are older than what Ukraine has today. So I would just say that, we need to invest in our own capabilities, but at the end of the day, there is a responsibility here to make sure that Ukraine has the capabilities, get them those old Sukhoi and MiG fighters, let's cut through the red tape, let's deliver it so they can protect their own airspace, and, there's other options that we'll have to talk to our allies about. But anyway, I should get going.
That this could lead Canada to war, though.
We're not declaring war. We're just trying to help people. This is responsibility to protect is what we're talking about.
Filion, je vous écoute d'abord en français. D'abord, c'est un plaidoyer qui devrait toucher l'ensemble des Canadiens et des Canadiennes, je dirais même l'humanité, parce que ce que M. Zelenskyy nous demandait d'imaginer, c'est l'imaginable. De voir qu'on a des écoles qui ont été bombardées là-bas, de voir qu'il y a des gens qui sont en train de mourir là-bas, de voir qu'on voit une destruction massive d'un peuple en libre qui demande seulement à vivre dans une démocratie. Je pense que ce qui nous a appelés, c'est d'aller à l'intérieur de nous, de chacun, dans notre cœur, dans notre tête, de dire « imaginez l'inimaginable ». Et c'est ce qui arrive présentement en Ukraine. Alors pour moi, c'est un appel à l'action mondiale de faire plus encore pour s'assurer que les combats cessent, pour s'assurer que la démocratie soit restaurée et s'assurer aussi que M. Poutine et son régime payent le grand prix justement pour la dévastation et les vies humaines qui ont été enlevées en Ukraine.
La chef intérimaire conservatrice demandait une zone d'exclusion aérienne pour les couloirs humanitaires. Vous avez été ministre des Affaires étrangères, vous en pensez quoi?
Ben, écoutez, je pense qu'à ce moment-ci, quand on regarde à l'étape du conflit où on en est, tout doit être considéré. Il y a évidemment des considérations très complexes sur les questions des zones, ce qu'on appelle les no-fly zones. Il y a évidemment, je pense qu'il faut prendre les mesures appropriées, mais avoir aussi une approche réfléchie là-dessus, parce qu'évidemment, on veut prévenir une aggravation du conflit. Mais je pense qu'à ce moment-ci, ces questions-là se posent, et je vais laisser évidemment mes collègues qui sont responsables des ministres des Affaires étrangères de parler de la politique canadienne là-dessus, mais je pense qu'on est tous interpellés par la dévastation qu'on voit présentement en Ukraine.
C'est pas une provocation? Est-ce que les Russes...
Ben, je pense que c'est ça. On a vu l'histoire. L'histoire nous enseigne beaucoup de choses, et je pense que lorsqu'on parle de zone d'exclusion, il faut bien définir ce que ça veut dire, mais aussi être très conscient des risques que ça pourrait amener. Je pense que dans un moment de crise comme celui-là, ça demande d'avoir une approche très réfléchie, et certainement avec nos alliés de l'OTAN sur cette question-là. I think that when you're looking at something, the extent of the devastation that you're seeing, the extent of the human suffering, the extent of the destruction that we've seen over the last few days, you always have to look at what more we can do. Now, obviously, when you look at no-fly zone, there's a lot of issues around that in order not to escalate a conflict. But we heard President Zelenskyy, and I think that our allies and the world is looking at what more can be done at this stage.
Would a humanitarian corridor, no-fly zone, still be considered an escalation, do you think?
I would think that at this stage, considering the devastation we've seen, the international community is seized of that question, and I think we need to consider what can be done, what are the smart moves we can do to make sure that we can protect more people in Ukraine in front of the human suffering that we're seeing. Merci.
La proposition de Mme Burden d'imposer une zone d'exclusion aérienne pour les couloirs humanitaires, vous en pensez quoi? Est-ce que c'est quelque chose que le Canada envisage avec ses alliés?
Bien, je suis contente de te voir ici, Mélanie. J'espère que tu as eu un bon voyage. Donc, au niveau de ce que Mme Burden a dit, il va de soi que la position du gouvernement du Canada a toujours été la même que celle de ses alliés, c'est-à-dire que l'objectif est de ne pas déclarer un conflit international, donc une troisième guerre mondiale. Les gens s'attendent à ce que ce soit notre position, et donc on va agir en conséquence. Du reste, je pense qu'on doit être proactif dans le fait d'aider l'Ukraine à contrecarrer l'offensive russe. C'est pourquoi on continue encore et toujours à offrir des armes à l'Ukraine, à ce que ces armes-là se rendent sur place, et en même temps, encore et toujours en faire plus au niveau des sanctions.
Does the no-fly zone automatically lead to the Third
I'll
World
get
War?
to you. I'll get to you.
Est-ce que ça veut dire non, clairement? C'est quelque chose que vous écartez?
Comme je vous ai dit, notre objectif, c'est toujours de ne pas générer un conflit international, et c'est pourquoi la position à date de l'OTAN et aussi de ses membres a été la même.
Does the no-fly zone automatically lead to the Third World War in your eyes?
We have been consistent throughout the alliance in making sure that there would be a red line, and this red line would be not to trigger an international conflict. That has been our position. Now, we want to make sure that we can support Ukraine to defend its airspace. We will do so, obviously, by providing military support, when I say military, lethal aid, as well as making sure that we, again, continue to have strong sanctions. It is important for Canada to be able also to provide that lethal aid directly to Ukraine. My colleague, Minister Anand, has been doing a great amount of work on this. Many of the deliveries have been successfully delivered. And
Actually, you didn't answer my question, which was, is there no way to institute a no-fly zone, even a partial one, without triggering war?
we are always willing to look at many scenarios right now because we know Ukrainian people need help. And Canada will always lead conversations to find creative solutions. But at this point, based on the information we have a red line that we can't cross.
Minister, I understand that Russia has sanctioned
to Russia. What's your response to that?
I'm not surprised, and I won't back down.
Will it have any impact? I mean, surely you don't have any dealings, business dealings or other, with Russia or Russian entities in Canada. So what do you see it as?
Well, sorry, I just want to understand your question, Donna.
Do you have any dealings, economic or otherwise, business or otherwise, that might be affected by sanctions, or is this more a diplomatic persona non grata thing?
No, and my mother would be very surprised if I did.
Est-ce que vous avez l'impression que vous en faites? Est-ce que vous avez l'impression que vous en faites assez? Parce que clairement, le président ukrainien, ce qu'il a dit aujourd'hui, c'est qu'il faut vraiment que le Canada en fasse plus. Il a parlé de cette zone d'exclusion aérienne. Est-ce que jusqu'à maintenant, vous avez l'impression que le Canada en a fait assez?
Écoutez, j'ai eu plusieurs conversations avec mon homologue ukrainien, encore ce week-end et encore hier. Donc, Dimitro Kuleba et moi, nous parlons à peu près à chaque jour ou à chaque 2 jours. Ce qu'il m'a dit hier, m'a dit, Mélanie, le plus important, c'est que le Canada nous envoie des armes et nous envoie et fasse en sorte de mettre en place des sanctions extrêmement sévères. Pourquoi? Parce que certainement ça aide l'Ukraine à se défendre, mais ça aide aussi l'Ukraine à la table de négociation. Alors c'est pourquoi nous allons continuer à offrir ce soutien. Et en même temps, je suis en contact avec mes collègues du G7 parce que c'est important qu'on puisse être coordonnés et qu'on ait énormément d'impact ensemble. C'est comme ça qu'on a fonctionné depuis le début et c'est ce qu'on fait.
Pour les réfugiés, pourquoi est-ce qu'il n'y a pas encore de pont aérien entre, par exemple, la Pologne et le Canada? On entend toutes sortes d'histoires de réfugiés qui ont du mal à venir au Canada. Pourquoi est-ce que c'est pas encore fait, ce point?
Il va de soi que mon collègue, le ministre de l'Immigration, aura l'occasion de donner plus d'informations sur le nouveau programme qui va être mis en place à partir du 17 mars, donc sous peu. J'ai eu plusieurs conversations, le Premier ministre également, concernant comment on peut aider les différents pays voisins de l'Ukraine. Certainement, notre objectif est de pouvoir justement amener ces réfugiés-là. Donc, les conversations ont lieu et on va pouvoir en dire plus sous peu.
Mais justement, par rapport à ce que par exemple, la Pologne demande, le président ukrainien disait la semaine passée qu'il aimerait avoir des avions canadiens pour sortir les gens de la Pologne. C'est quelque chose que vous considérez toujours?
Tous les scénarios sont sur la table. Notre objectif est de pouvoir faire en sorte d'amener les réfugiés. Le programme, comme je vous ai dit, de visa arrive en place le 17 mars, donc cette semaine.
Mais pour sortir les gens, pour extirper les gens. Parce que c'est de ça dont ils ont besoin. Il y a trop de gens de la Pologne et tout.
Je comprends, mais
comment on fait pour les sortir?
Pour faire en sorte que les réfugiés viennent, il faut au départ qu'ils postulent à nos programmes. Donc, on va ouvrir le programme, ils vont pouvoir postuler et après, on va pouvoir travailler avec les gens qui sont intéressés à venir au Canada. Donc, ça, c'est pour une chose, le premier scénario. L'autre scénario, c'est certainement la réunification familiale. Donc, on sait que la communauté ukrainienne est très importante au Canada. On l'a entendu plusieurs fois aujourd'hui. Il y a 1,4 million d'Ukrainiens au Canada. Donc, il y a de la réunification familiale qui se fait présentement. Et donc, dans les circonstances, on va vouloir travailler aussi avec ces personnes-là qui veulent être réunifiées avec leur famille. Mais vous savez, le Premier ministre et plusieurs membres de son cabinet ont fait partie des efforts pour faire venir 40 000 réfugiés syriens à l'époque. J'étais sur le comité de coordination à l'époque et on a bien travaillé ensemble. Alors, on va, bien entendu, bien travailler pour faire venir les réfugiés.
If your Ukrainian counterpart is asking for tougher and stronger and further sanctions, why does it seem like Canada is just going progressively slow?
Well, that's not his opinion, and this is clearly not our opinion either. I think what we need to do is continue every day, every week to announce sanctions like we did just today. When we do so in coordination with the G7 ministers of foreign affairs. This is through our different diplomatic channels, and we're coordinating. That being said, we know we have to do more. And we know that our sanctions must go really around Putin and in targeting Putin himself, which we have done. But we, as I mentioned on the question of the no-fly zone, we're in creative mode. We want to make sure that we have as strong sanctions as possible because we know they work and we know we have to continue that economic pressure. Wait,
Conservatives say that...
You've asked a question, so I'll take somebody and I'll get to you.
What can you do without crossing that red line? The President is asking Canada to do more. What else is in your arsenal before you cross that red line?
like I mentioned, we need to make sure, first and foremost, on the lethal weapon side, we need to continue our deliveries. My colleague, Minister Anand, is doing a fantastic job on that. On the question of sanctions, we need to do more. We will be doing more. My team and I are on it, and we're working with our G7 ministers as well, and working with Chrystia Freeland, Minister of Finance, on it. What we need to do also, we need to continue diplomatically speaking to isolate Russia and put maximum pressure. We're doing that in different forums across the board, but we're looking also at other scenarios to isolate Russia.
Can you respond to the Conservatives who said today in the House that Canada should support a no-fly zone over humanitarian corridors? Has your red line meant that you will not support a no-fly zone over humanitarian corridors should they be negotiated?
Well, first and foremost, Russia needs to accept that there are humanitarian corridors. And when they have humanitarian corridors in place, they can bomb civilians at the same time or help their army.
So
Meanwhile,
what's the answer to Canada, though?
So our goal is to make sure that we follow up the negotiations and to push to make sure that there are indeed humanitarian corridors, and these humanitarian corridors are how can I say, safe for civilians, and that Russia stops lying about how they are protecting civilians when it comes to humanitarian corridors, which is a fundamental issue.
Is that a no to Canadian patrols over those corridors?
Our goal is to make sure that, like I mentioned, that we protect civilians when there are humanitarian corridors, but at the same time, we need to make sure, with all the members of the alliance, that we don't cross the red line of of making sure that there is an international conflict. And so,
combien de réfugiés ukrainiens est-ce que le Canada est prêt à accepter? Vous avez parlé des 40 000 Syriens, 40 000 avions aussi. Pour les Ukrainiens, c'est combien?
On a déjà dit que la demande, dans le fond, le nombre allait être illimité.
Illimité.
What's Canada willing to do
Est-ce que vous
to...
étiez au courant que vous n'étiez plus amis sur le territoire? Est-ce que vous aviez été averti de ça? Ou est-ce qu'on vient de vous l'apprendre?
J'ai été informée ce matin, je ne suis pas surprise, puis ça fait pas en sorte qu'on va reculer ou que je vais reculer.
The key thing the president asked for in his speech wasn't a fly zone, so I just want to be perfectly clear.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
The key thing that Mr. Zelenskyy asked for in his speech was in a fly zone, so I just want to be clear with you. There's nothing that he said in his speech that has changed your mind about Canada potentially enforcing any kind of no-fly zone.
So the key thing that the president said today was that Canada was leading the international efforts and supporting Ukraine. I was there when the Prime Minister called Zelenskyy. We were both in Munich in Germany last week. And when the Prime Minister asked Zelenskyy whether he wanted to address Canadians through the House of Commons, President Zelenskyy said overwhelmingly yes, because Canada has been one of our greatest allies. This was shown today in his speech. And so therefore, we will do as much as possible. We know that Canadians from all walks of life, from coast to coast to coast, are engaged and want us to do even more, and will do so. But at the same time, Canadians expect us to be acting in a way that we're not triggering an international conflict.
But President Zelenskyy also said that he wants Canada to go further. He also mentioned quite clearly that if you imagine asking your friends for help and then you get basically thoughts and prayers, does that speak directly to what Canada's been doing in response?
No, of course not. You've been reporting that we've been sending weapons pretty much every
Right, but
week,
he wants a no-fly
and at the
zone.
same time sanctions. So we all know that that's not the case.
But he wants a no-fly zone.
And I said, and you've asked me the question, and my answer has been, since the beginning, we need to make sure that we're not triggering an international conflict. And at the same time, we're in creative mode, and we're willing to talk with allies to see how we can further support Ukraine.
Ça veut dire quoi, être en mode créatif?
Je pense que, vous le savez, le Canada n'est pas une superpuissance militaire, n'est pas une puissance nucléaire non plus. Alors, notre objectif, c'est de travailler avec nos partenaires, d'amener tout le monde à la table, de faire le pont entre les Européens et également avec les Américains pour arriver avec une solution qui va pouvoir mettre un terme au conflit. Mais pour mettre un terme au conflit, entre-temps, il faut que les Ukrainiens soient bien outillés, soient capables de se défendre, parce qu'à la table de négociation, c'est ce qui va les aider à avoir ultimement une solution diplomatique qui a du bon sens. Et c'est pourquoi nous faisons notre part et nous incitons d'autres pays à faire leur part en mettant en place des sanctions très fortes et en même temps en offrant des armes.
La Russie vient déposer des sanctions contre M. Trudeau, contre vous, contre Mme Anand. Est-ce que ça vous indique vraiment qu'ils sont prêts à avoir une solution diplomatique?
Écoutez, je ne suis pas surprise. Personne n'est surpris. On s'y attendait. Puis, on a déjà mis en place des sanctions contre le président Poutine lui-même, contre le ministre des Affaires étrangères, contre le ministre de la Justice, le ministre des Finances, le ministre des Finances, contre tous les membres de la Douma. Donc, on savait qu'il allait y avoir des contre-sanctions. Donc, il n'y a pas de surprise, mais en même temps, ça ne va pas faire en sorte qu'on va reculer. Merci. Merci tout le monde. Thank you.
Bien, bonjour tout le monde. D'entrée de jeu, je dois vous dire que je suis singulièrement impressionné. On avait vu le président Zelenskyy dans les médias à plusieurs reprises et l'usage brillant qu'il fait des réseaux sociaux pour faire un contrepoids à l'usage odieux que fait la Russie de tout ce qui s'appelle appareils médias contrôlés et technologie de l'information. C'est assez remarquable. Et on comprend pourquoi il a réussi à attirer vers lui l'attention de la planète au complet, en allant chercher un soutien à la fois populaire et politique, sans lequel peut-être aujourd'hui l'Ukraine serait dans une position encore beaucoup plus délicate que ce qu'on observe. Cette solidarité-là qu'il a su commander s'exprime lorsque les pays libres du monde sont solidaires aussi avec l'Ukraine. Ça prend la forme, et on l'a dit souvent, ça doit prendre la forme pour le Canada d'actions concertées avec les pays libres du monde. Et on constate que ça se fait. Et quand c'est dans ce cadre-là, le Bloc québécois soutient le gouvernement canadien. Il y a par contre quelques enjeux qui relèvent davantage de la politique intérieure. En fait, de la politique extérieure peut-être, mais dont les décisions se prennent de façon davantage purement canadienne, si je peux le dire comme ça. Il y a, l'enjeu de l'importance de la contribution militaire. On donne difficilement ce qu'on n'a pas. Là, on ne sera pas d'accord au plan militaire. Le Canada est un atome 2B. Là, c'est pas un joueur important. Il peut pas fournir ce qu'il n'y a pas. Le Canada peut faire beaucoup en termes humanitaires. D'ailleurs, j'invite le gouvernement à simplement sauter le plafond de l'appariement du financement, qui était à 10 millions, qui est devenu à 30 millions. Vous savez, 30 millions, c'est même pas $1 par citoyen du Canada. Il ne devrait pas y avoir de plafond parce que envoyer des ressources médicales, des ressources alimentaires pour les gens qui sont en Ukraine ou qui sortent de l'Ukraine ou qui sont dans des endroits où sont les réfugiés, je pense que ça reste un enjeu majeur. Ce sur quoi je veux insister, profiter de la tribune que ça donne, ce contexte-là pour insister, c'est la mise en place de la passerelle humanitaire. Je ne veux pas utiliser pont aérien parce que c'est une expression à connotation militaire, mais une passerelle, une navette humanitaire. Et là, comment dire ça, c'est juste trop long. Arrêtez les critères, les paramètres, les tergiversations, les supputations, arrêtez, là. Lorsque des gens sont exposés à recevoir des bombes sur la tête, lorsque des gens plient bagages avec un baluchon puis le bien personnel dans une vieille poussette à bébé pour sortir de l'Ukraine, tu leur demandes pas de faire des tests biométriques, puis tu leur demandes pas de remplir des papiers de visa. C'est pas une opération d'immigration, c'est une opération de sauvetage. Ça se gère comme une opération de sauvetage. Tu mets en place des vols nolisés, tu vas chercher les gens qui en ont besoin, tu les amènes au Canada, puis il y en aura même là-dedans que leur destination finale n'est pas le Canada, mais tu les aideras à s'en aller là où ils voudront aller. Il faut sauver des vies de réfugiés ukrainiens. Et n'importe qui fait des téléphones et demander à n'importe qui dans des bureaux de circonscription, ils vont vous le dire, l'appareil des fonctionnaires d'Immigration Canada ne suit pas le rythme, n'est pas capable de livrer la marchandise présentement, puis il y a des vies humaines à la fin de la journée qui auront été perdues. Alors je dis, laissez faire les critères de différentes natures, faites les tests de sécurité à l'arrivée sur le territoire, comme ça s'est fait dans le passé, allez chercher ces gens-là, amenez-les au Canada, amenez-les au Québec, s'il vous plaît, sauvez des vies.
Par rapport aux armes, juste par rapport aux armes, vous dites qu'on est à tombe 2B, mais en même temps, dans votre discours, vous avez mis beaucoup l'accent sur le fait qu'on doit en envoyer plus
ça ne vient pas que du Canada, là. Globalement.
Je veux juste savoir, alors vous parlez de quoi, au juste?
Je pense que la communauté internationale doit continuer à fournir des armes à l'Ukraine. Pas que le Canada. Bon, si le Canada peut fournir quelque chose de valable, tant mieux. Mais c'est clair que le Canada n'est pas une puissance militaire, puis il n'a pas du tout à sa disposition des ressources militaires qui vont faire la grande différence dans cette guerre-là. Mais il s'agit d'une action concertée avec les pays libres. Il y en a qui sont davantage en mesure que le Canada de donner une aide à caractère purement militaire. Moi, j'encourage ceux qui le peuvent à le faire. Le Canada est capable peut-être d'aider davantage au niveau humanitaire, qu'ils le fassent. L'un n'empêche pas l'autre, mais on ne fera pas semblant d'être un poids lourd dans un ring où on n'est pas un poids lourd.
Par rapport aux réfugiés, donc, est-ce que vous proposez de lever toutes les obligations de visa? Est-ce que c'est ça que ça veut dire?
En fait, je trouve un peu farfelu l'argument du fait qu'il pourrait y avoir des partisans de la Russie qui viendraient au Canada avec ça. D'abord, il y en a déjà, là. Fréquentez vos propres réseaux sociaux, vous allez voir qu'il y a déjà des faux et des vrais comptes pro-russes qui se multiplient au point que c'en est ridicule. Et aussi, c'est que les tests de sécurité peuvent être faits à l'arrivée, comme ça s'est fait dans le passé à plusieurs reprises. Je ne comprends pas l'obstination du gouvernement à vouloir tester des gens qui viennent d'une nation éminemment pacifique avant de les accueillir dans un pays, sur un territoire où il y a déjà énormément de ressortissants ukrainiens qui pourraient les accueillir plus facilement que dans d'autres juridictions au monde.
Parmi l'action concertée avec les alliés, il y a Mme Duggan qui a proposé d'en faire davantage pour établir une zone d'exclusion aérienne au-dessus des couloirs humanitaires. Vous en pensez quoi, cette suggestion-là?
Je suis d'accord avec le gouvernement canadien sur le fait que c'est un risque qu'on ne peut pas se permettre de prendre. Je suis pas prêt à me réfugier derrière mon rôle de parti d'opposition pour demander quelque chose qui semblerait à ce stade-ci irresponsable. Le président russe, en fait, n'importe qui est prêt à assassiner des milliers de personnes est forcément dérangé mentalement. Et ce dérangé mental-là a le doigt sur le piton nucléaire. Je ne suis pas de ceux qui prétendent que nous sommes à l'orée d'une guerre nucléaire, mais jouons pas avec le feu. Évidemment, la Russie, en tout cas le régime Poutine, parce que je veux pas confondre le régime Poutine et la population russe, mais la Russie va interpréter ou dire que c'est un acte de guerre, le cas échéant, avec un risque d'escalade qu'on doit éviter. On a le droit de penser que dans l'état actuel des choses, tranquillement, peut-être quelque chose se met en place vers d'éventuelles négociations plus sérieuses. On commence à pouvoir sentir ça, malheureusement. Le régime du Kremlin assortit ces négociations de gestes d'une violence absolument inouïe pour maintenir la terreur, puis l'Occident, puis les nations libres, incluant bien sûr l'Australie ou la Nouvelle-Zélande ou le Japon, là. Tout ce monde-là doit maintenir une pression et rétablir un rapport de force au bénéfice de l'Ukraine pour être capable d'avoir une négociation davantage équilibrée.
Mais qu'est-ce qu'ils cherchent, vous pensez, les conservateurs, en proposant ça?
Je ne sais pas. Je sais toutefois qu'il arrive en politique, lorsqu'on est dans l'opposition, qu'on puisse faire une proposition à sa face même peu responsable, parce qu'on n'a pas la responsabilité de l'assumer ensuite.
Vous avez parlé d'impuissance dans votre discours. Une des demandes de M. Zelenskyy, c'est une zone d'exclusion aérienne. Vous dites qu'on ne peut pas faire ça. Mm-hmm. Comment est-ce que vous vous sentez par rapport à toutes ces demandes? Est-ce que vous avez l'impression que, finalement, le Canada ne peut pas faire grand-chose?
Le Canada fait présentement une contribution dont le principal défaut est la lenteur. Mais lorsque le Canada travaille en concertation et en coordination avec l'ONU, avec l'OTAN, avec le G20, avec le G7, pour imposer des sanctions ou acheminer une aide humanitaire ou militaire, je suis là, je soutiens ces démarches-là du gouvernement canadien de la même manière que je pense qu'en matière d'espace aérien, ils sont à la bonne place, la position est la bonne. Je demande simplement que l'aide humanitaire soit augmentée et que la passerelle aérienne, la passerelle humanitaire soit mise en place sans davantage de délai. Ça, on analyse des avions, envoie-la là-bas, remplis-la, ramène-la, rendu ici, on fera toutes les vérifications de sécurité une fois rendu sur le territoire canadien. On laisse pas quelqu'un dans une position aussi périlleuse que ce que les gens vivent là-bas sous prétexte qu'on veut faire des tests. I'm sorry?
The new list of 313 Canadians that Russia has sanctioned, you're on the list. I'm wondering what you think about that.
Am I on the list?
You're number 29.
Oh, okay.
You seem happy.
Thank you, Vladimir. I would simply say that this is part of a show in which I didn't ask to be part, but I don't take this very seriously. And I must admit that I did not plan to go in Russia anytime soon.
Mais vous ne saviez pas?
No.
What more do you think Canada ought to be doing for refugees?
Act much, much, much faster. You do not ask people to go through some tests and verifications and biometric tests when their life is actually threatened. You rent planes, you send the planes over there, you fill the planes, you bring them back, and then you have all the time in the world to make all the tests and all the inquiries you want to do about those people. Now, the idea is to save lives, and I believe there's nothing else to be done than do it fast. There's a difference between immigration and saving lives. It's a matter of saving lives.
Why do you think the government hasn't done that already?
I would like to know. If I did know, I would make some suggestions. For the time being, I do not understand. Alexis has been working on that for days and days and asking for it. I understand that the machine, immigration Canadian machine, is not entirely up to the task now. So that's one more reason to put some criteria aside and just go help people, bring them here. Some of them will want to stay, some of them will want to go back afterwards, and we have to respect that. But now there's an emergency, let's behave accordingly.
Does it seem to you like anything was learned from...
Je te permets.
L'OIF doit se prononcer demain sur la position que le Canada doit prendre contre l'Ukraine, contre l'invasion en Ukraine. Il ne s'est pas prononcé encore, il y a un conseil ministériel demain. Est-ce que c'est pas un peu embarrassant que l'Organisation internationale de la francophonie ne soit pas encore prononcée là-dessus 20 jours après le gouvernement?
C'est une excellente question. En fait, l'Organisation internationale de la francophonie est à la base tout sauf militaire. Et son rôle là-dedans semble peut-être un peu plus lointain. Moi, j'aurais tendance à le voir comme ça. Je ne crois pas que les pays francophones soient moins sensibles à la situation en Ukraine que n'importe qui d'autre, et probablement même le contraire, parce qu'il y a un nombre significatif d'Ukrainiens qui ont une intéressante maîtrise du français d'ailleurs, mais j'aurais pas de réponse plus précise à vous donner. J'encourage toutes les organisations internationales à prendre une position aussi claire que possible, le but étant toujours, et je le répète, de donner un rapport de force à l'Ukraine et au président Zelenskyy face à un adversaire, face à un ennemi dont le rapport de force est construit par la pure violence sauvage.
Dernière question. Oui, juste peut-être votre réaction en français sur le fait que vous ne pouvez plus vous rendre en Russie en ce moment.
Ouais. D'abord, je remercie le président Poutine de me reconnaître comme un adversaire de son régime odieux, et je dois vous avouer que dans mes plans de vacances, il n'y avait pas la Russie. I'm sorry,
who's been sanctioned by Russia so far has kind of laughed it off. Do you feel like officials in Russia feel the same way about sanctions from Canada?
There's a difference between the sanctions which I am imposed, which mean absolutely nothing, and the sanctions which are imposed to some oligarchs, which lose tens of millions of dollars a day because of those sanctions. They must feel it hurts a little bit more. Merci beaucoup.
I thought it was incredibly powerful.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, thank you very much for coming. Ukraine is on fire. The country is being decimated before the eyes of the world. The impact on civilians is reaching terrifying proportions. Countless innocent people, including women and children, have been killed. After being hit by Russian forces, roads, airports, and schools lie in ruins. According to the World Health Organization, at least 24 health facilities have suffered attacks. Hundreds of thousands of people are without water or electricity. And with each passing hour, two things are increasingly clear. First, it keeps getting worse. Second, whatever the outcome, this war will have no winners, only losers. The United Nations and the humanitarian partners are working to ensure safe passage from besieged areas and to provide aid where security permits. More than 600,000 people have received some form of aid. As millions of people in Ukraine face hunger and dwindling supplies of water and medicine, I'm announcing today that the United Nations will allocate a further $40 million from the Central Emergency Response Fund to ramp up vital assistance to reach the most vulnerable as we wait for the nations to come. This funding will help get critical supplies of food, water, medicines, and other life-saving aid into the country, as well as provide cash assistance to the needy. But the avenues in and out of encircled cities are more precarious by the day. And I underscore the crucial importance of respecting international humanitarian law. At least 1.9 million people are displaced inside the country, and growing numbers are escaping across borders. I'm deeply grateful for the solidarity of Ukraine's neighbors and other host countries who have taken in more than 2.8 million refugees in the past 2 weeks. The vast majority of those making the treacherous journey are women and children who are increasingly vulnerable. For predators and human traffickers, war is not a tragedy, it is an opportunity. And women and children are the targets. They need safety and support every step of the way. I will continue to highlight the desperate plight of the people of Ukraine as I am doing again today. Yet, there is another dimension of this conflict that gets obscured. This war goes far beyond Ukraine. It is also an assault on the world's most vulnerable people and countries. While war reigns over Ukraine, a sword of Damocles hangs over the global economy, especially in the developing world. Even before the conflict, developing countries were struggling to recover from the pandemic with record inflation, rising interest rates, and looming debt burdens. Their ability to respond has been erased by exponential increases in the cost of financing. Now, their breadbasket is being bombed. Russia and Ukraine represent more than half of the world's supply of sunflower oil and about 30% of the world's wheat. Ukraine alone provides more than half of the world's food program's wheat supply. Food, fuel, and fertilizer prices are skyrocketing. Supply chains are being disrupted, and the costs and delays of transportation of imported goods when available are at record levels. And all of this is hitting the poorest, the hardest, and planting the seeds for political instability and unrest around the globe. Grain prices have already exceeded those at the start of the Arab Spring and the food riots of 2007-2008. The FAO's Global Food Prices Index is at its highest level ever. 45 African and least developed countries import at least 1/3 of their wheat from Ukraine and Russia. 18 of those countries import at least 50%. This includes countries like Burkina Faso, Egypt, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. We must do everything possible to avert a hurricane of hunger and the meltdown of the global food system. In addition, we are seeing clear evidence of this war draining resources and attention from other trouble spots in desperate need. I renew my appeal for countries to find creative ways to finance increased humanitarian and development recovery needs worldwide and to give generously and to immediately release pledged funds. My plea to leaders is to resist the temptation of increasing military budget at the expense of official development assistance and climate action. In a word, developing countries are getting pummeled. They face a cascade of crises beyond the Ukraine war. We cannot forget COVID and the impacts of climate change, in particular drought. Against the backdrop of these immense interconnected challenges, I'm announcing today the establishing of a global crisis response group on food, energy and finance in the UN Secretariat. I've also asked the Deputy Secretary General to lead an interagency steering committee with partners to oversee these efforts. And in the coming days, we will be consulting with member states willing to champion the actions needed to carry forward the global emergency response that will be required for this looming crisis. Make no mistake, everyday people, especially women and children, will bear the brunt of this unfolding tragedy. The war also shows how the global addiction to fossil fuels is placing energy security, climate action, and the entire global economy at the mercy of geopolitics. Finally, further escalation of the war, whether by accident or design, threatens all of humanity. Raising the alert of Russian nuclear forces is a bone-chilling development. The prospect of nuclear conflict, once unthinkable, is now back within the realm of possibility. The security and safety of nuclear facilities must also be preserved. It's time to stop the horror unleashed on the people of Ukraine and get on the path of diplomacy and peace. I've been in close contact with a number of countries, including China, France, Germany, India, Israel, and Turkey, on mediation efforts to bring an end to this war. The appeals for peace must be heard. This tragedy must stop. It's never too late for diplomacy and dialogue. We need an immediate cessation of hostilities and serious negotiations based on the principles of the UN Charter and international law. We need peace. Peace for the people of Ukraine. Peace for the world. We need peace now. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. All right, first question, Margaret Boucher.
Thank you, Secretary General. Do you support Ukraine's calls for a no-fly zone?
That is a matter that, as you know, has been analyzed by a number of countries that considered that possibility as a risk of escalation that could create a global conflict. And it is based on that analysis that I think we need to be prudent, even if I understand the dramatic appeal of the Ukrainian government.
Alan Bulkati.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary General. Donetsk authorities reported today that Ukrainian side hit the heart of the city of Donetsk by missile .U, and the warhead of this missile was filled by the cluster munitions. I was following the Security Council, but I haven't heard anything about this. Is the UN aware of this incident?
I've seen the news about this incident, and I have to say that our position is very clear. Any attack on civilians or civilian infrastructure is regrettable if accidental and condemnable if done on purpose. But let's be clear, the overwhelming majority of civilian casualties and the overwhelming majority of civilian infrastructure destructed was done in the context of the war by the Russian forces.
Thank you, Secretary General. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. You talk about mediation, but the talks have adjourned for the day. Is there anything you have done or will do, and have you reached out to Russia's President Putin? Thank you.
Yes, we are doing our best. I've talked with a number of leaders that are in permanent contact with President Putin, and of course we consider that it's absolutely essential for an additional effort to make the Russian Federation understand that this war is becoming an absolute nightmare, and to create the conditions for the war to be stopped and for serious negotiations to be put in place. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to have briefed the United Nations Security Council in my capacity of a chairman in office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Both the United Nations and the OSCE work to maintain international peace and security and safeguard the respect for international law, including the basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. This is why they both condemned in the strongest terms the military aggression of Russia on Ukraine. Indiscriminate attacks against civilians, shelling hospitals and schools is not only inhuman, it is nothing but a crime under international law. The OSCE Polish chairmanship is now facing a completely different reality than a month ago. The war in Ukraine has dominated its agenda almost completely. Russian aggression shakes the very foundation of the OSCE. We see Russia defy its primary responsibility to act as a guardian of international peace and security, both as a member of OSCE as well as the permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Instead, it chooses to act as an aggressor. This long-planned military attack, with the participation of another state, Belarus, is unprovoked, unjustified, and illegal. Such a flagrant breach of OSCE principles and commitments poses questions about stability of the rules-based order. Still, we believe OSCE is able to keep the states talking in good times and bad. Poland is convinced it is in the best interest of the organization and its participating states to work on proper modus operandi to fulfill OSCE's mandate. Right now, the primary focus of OSCE work in Ukraine will be to help avert humanitarian crisis and create the conditions for assistance and evacuation. OSCE stands ready to continue its cooperation with the United Nations. We have established close coordination with the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, International Organization for Migration, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. The OSCE welcomes any genuine effort that contributes to stopping the ongoing hostilities and can lead to finding a sustainable, peaceful solution. With that said, talk must be accompanied by actions. I reiterate the joint call I made with OSCE Secretary General Helga Schmidt on the very first day of the Russian aggression for the immediate cessation of all military activities. We call on Russia to stop the deplorable acts. We call on Russia to stop shelling civilians where attempts of evacuation. We call on Russia to stop shelling and dropping bombs on homes, hospitals, and streets full of innocent people, most of whom are children and women. We call on Russia to honor its international obligations and commitments. Any sustainable political solution must fully respect sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine within its international recognized borders. Finally, we call on Russia to engage in a meaningful and substantial dialogue to seek a peaceful solution to the current crisis. The door to diplomacy is still open. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister Rao. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. You have accommodated so many refugees. At what point is that a problem for Poland? How many can you take in, and what do you need to do that? Thank you.
Ma'am, I must say that we used to host 1.5 million people before this crisis. So the Ukrainians who visited us and who decided to stay with us were living, working, studying and learning in Poland. Since the beginning of aggression, we have received 1.6 million Ukrainians. The overwhelming majority of them are in touch with their friends and relatives who already live in Poland. But the Polish government is assisting the spontaneous support of Polish society that is being extended to them. So we have just adopted the Bill of Law that gives all the privileges that we, the Polish citizens, enjoy in respect of healthcare, opportunities to learn and study in Polish schools and Polish universities, also the access to labor market, and also the opportunity to take part in our economic life, for example, by launching their own businesses in Poland. So all that indicates that we are ready to host a considerable number of our Ukrainian neighbors who are in need. But certainly no country can do anything like that on its own. So let me just tell you that when Europe went through the immigration crisis in 2015, the continent as a whole received less than 1 million immigrants. Now in Poland alone, we have already 1.6 million refugees of war. And think about other neighboring countries which accepted a smaller portion, but still a very considerable of this influx. So it's more than obvious that, as I said, there is no country in the world that can handle this kind of humanitarian crisis on its own.
Hello, Mr. Minister. I'm Margaret Bashir with the Voice of America. In your national capacity, I'd like to ask you, the United States has expressed objections to Poland transferring its MiG jets to Ukraine. Ukraine is still asking for them. Have you been in touch with your Ukrainian counterpart to try and find a workaround to still deliver these jets? Is this still a possibility?
I'm in touch with our American counterparts, with our NATO and European Union counterparts and, of course, with the Ukrainian ones. As far as your question is concerned, I can only say that this kind of decision has to be made by the NATO alliance as a whole, but not one member state, because the impact of this kind of decision is going to affect the alliance as a whole. So there is no one single NATO member who could make this decision for the rest of the alliance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister. And
thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Bye-bye.
The 8,991st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Threats to International Peace and Security. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of the Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Madam President, the war in Ukraine is now in its third week. Fighting continues unabated. The Russian armed forces are pursuing their offensive operations and laying siege to several cities in the south, east, and north of the country. A large concentration of Russian forces is reportedly massed along several approaches to the capital, Kiev. The situation is particularly alarming in Mariupol, Kharkiv, Sumy, and Chernihiv, where there is shelling of residential areas and civilian infrastructure, resulting in an increasing number of civilians killed and injured. The utter devastation being visited on these cities is horrific. The numbers bear out the conclusion that civilians are paying the highest price for the conflict. As of 11 March, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded a total of 1,546 civilian casualties, including 564 killed and 982 injured since the start of the invasion on 24 February. OHCHR believes the real casualty figures are likely considerably higher, as information from locations whose intense hostilities are ongoing has been delayed, and reports are still pending corroboration. Most of the recorded civilian casualties, which include children, have been caused by explosive weapons with a wide impact area, including heavy artillery and multi-launch rocket systems and missile and airstrikes. OHCHR has received credible reports of Russian forces using cluster munitions, including in populated areas. Indiscriminate attacks, including those using cluster munitions, which are of a nature to strike military objectives and civilians or civilian objects without distinction, are prohibited under international humanitarian law. Direct attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as well as so-called area bombardment in towns and villages, are also prohibited under international law and may amount to war crimes. As of 10 March, the World Health Organization has verified 26 attacks on health facilities, health workers, and ambulances, causing 12 deaths and 34 injuries. This includes the bombing of the Mariupol Maternity Hospital on 9 March. We condemn such attacks without reservation. They cause not only death and destruction, they also deprive people of urgently needed care and endanger more lives. We cannot emphasize it enough. The targeting of civilians, of residential buildings, hospitals, schools, kindergartens is inexcusable and intolerable. All alleged violations of international human law must be investigated and those found responsible held accountable. Madam President, millions of people in Ukraine need urgent assistance. This includes 2 million internally displaced people. We are scaling up humanitarian aid in areas where security permits. More than 500,000 people are now receiving assistance, including life-saving food, shelter, blankets, and medical supplies. The United Nations and our partners have developed operational plans to meet humanitarian needs where they are most acute. This work needs funding. Over $1.5 billion was pledged to the appeals last week. We are grateful for this generosity and encourage donors to release the funding quickly. Madam President, it is critical to urgently achieve a cessation of hostilities, to allow for the safe passage of civilians from besieged areas, and to ensure that life-saving humanitarian supplies can reach those who remain. On 9 March, over 51,000 people were reportedly evacuated through 5 out of 6 agreed-upon safe passages. These safe passages must continue. They should be implemented with clear principles and modalities. Civilians should be duly and timely informed of the possibility to leave the concerned areas and, on a voluntary basis, and in the direction they choose. To expand life-saving assistance and services to those most in need, humanitarian actors must also have safe, rapid, unimpeded, and sustained access to all areas. We commend the humanitarian actors on the ground who are staying and delivering in a highly volatile situation. Madam President, the number of refugees from Ukraine has reached 2.5 million people. These numbers continue increasing by the day. We also commend the countries that have kept their borders open to welcome and support refugees. All people fleeing Ukraine, including third country nationals, need access to safety and protection in line with the principle of non-refoulement and without any form of discrimination. Madam President, the need for negotiations to stop the war in Ukraine could not be more urgent. We note the 3 rounds of talks held thus far between Ukrainian and Russian delegations. We call for such efforts to intensify, including to further secure humanitarian and ceasefire arrangements as a matter of priority. We urge the sides to build on their contacts, such as the meeting yesterday between the foreign ministers of Ukraine and the Russian Federation in Antalya, Turkey. The logic of dialogue and diplomacy must prevail over the logic of war. The Secretary General is grateful to the many member states working in pursuit of a diplomatic solution to this dangerous conflict. He is in regular contact with regional and other leaders, and his good offices remain available. Madam President, let me affirm the U.S. commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. As the war grinds on, there's already much reflection about its implications beyond the tragedy it represents for Ukraine. We increasingly hear the use of terms such as turning point, defining moment, end of multilateralism. I believe this is not an exaggeration. Indeed, some consequences are already being felt economically and politically. Perhaps most alarming are the risks the violence poses to the global framework for peace and security. We must do everything we can to find a solution and put an end to this war. And we must do it now. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I thank Council members for the opportunity to brief you this morning. I am aware of reports that certain public health facilities are in areas impacted by armed conflict, putting the safety of those facilities at risk. I appeal to all parties in this conflict to ensure the safety of all such facilities in Ukraine. I am aware of media reports regarding allegations of biological weapons programs. The United Nations is not aware of any biological weapons programs. That is largely thanks to the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, which prohibits the development, production, acquisition, transfer, stockpiling, and use of biological and toxic weapons. The Russian Federation and Ukraine are both states parties to the convention. In addition, the Russian Federation is a depository government under the convention. All states parties to the convention have undertaken never in any circumstances to develop, produce, stockpile, or otherwise acquire or retain biological weapons. Biological weapons have been outlawed since the BWC entered into force in 1975. A total of 183 states have now joined the convention, and biological weapons are universally seen as being abhorrent and illegitimate. The BWC lacks a multilateral verification mechanism overseen by an independent organization, such as the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Therefore, assessing compliance with its obligations is a task for its states parties. Madam President, despite the lack of an international verification regime, the Biological Weapons Convention does, however, contain several measures to which concerned states parties can have recourse in order to address situations in which states parties have concerns or suspicions about the activities of their peers. For example, Article 5 of the Convention states that, and I quote, "The states parties to this convention undertake to consult one another and to cooperate in solving any problems which may arise in relation to the objective of or in the application of the provisions of this convention." End of quote. Within the framework of Article 5, states parties have established an annual exchange of information based upon the submission of confidence-building measures. States parties must declare information about relevant facilities and activities on their territory in order to prevent or reduce the occurrence of ambiguous doubts and suspicions between them. The Russian Federation and Ukraine both participate annually in the confidence-building measures. The annual reports submitted by the Russian Federation and Ukraine are available to all BWC states parties for the purposes of transparency and reassurance. In addition, and also within the framework of Article 5 of the Convention, states parties have developed procedures for clarifying ambiguous and unresolved matters, including the possible convening of a formal consultative meeting to consider such matters. Article 6 of the Convention states that, and I quote, "Any state party to this Convention which finds that any other state party is acting in breach of obligations deriving from the provisions of the Convention may lodge a complaint with the Security Council. If agreed by the Security Council, an investigation on the basis of the complaint received could be initiated. Article 6 of the Convention has never been activated. While these provisions have not been regularly used, they are nonetheless internationally agreed procedures that are available to be used to diffuse tensions and to address and resolve any concerns relating to compliance with obligations under the BWC in a multilateral setting. I would therefore encourage BWC states parties to consider making use of the available procedures for consultation and cooperation in order to resolve these issues. Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, situations such as this demonstrate the need to strengthen the BWC, to operationalize it, and to institutionalize it. I would therefore like to take this opportunity to encourage its states parties to come to the Convention's 9th Review Conference, scheduled to take place in Geneva later in 2022, committed to a series of overhaul of the Convention to ensure it is properly equipped and resourced to deal with the challenges ahead. Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, to conclude my statement, I would like to take this opportunity to address the worrying issue of the safety and security of nuclear power plants in Ukraine. An accident involving the nuclear facilities in Ukraine could have severe consequences for public health and environment, and all steps must be taken to avoid it. The possibility of an accident caused by failure to a reactor's power supply or the inability to provide regular maintenance is growing by the day. The forces in effective control of nuclear power plants in Ukraine must ensure their safe and secure operation. I am extremely concerned that 4 of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA's, 7 pillars of the safe and secure operations of facilities are reportedly not being implemented at Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia. Communications must be fully restored, and operating staff must be allowed to properly carry out their duties and to do so free of undue pressure. I would like to echo the Secretary General's support for IAEA Director General Grossi's efforts to develop a framework to ensure the safety and security of Ukraine's facilities, and welcome the constructive meetings he held in Turkey on 10th of March with the foreign ministers of Ukraine and the Russian Federation. I thank you very much for your attention.
After the Rome meeting, since the war began, has China provided any military or economic aid to Russia or expressed any specific intentions to do so?
I'm not in a position to confirm or detail any intelligence from here at this point in time.
Okay. Moving on to the Russia-Ukraine talks. What does the U.S. see that would be a sign for optimism that some kind of ceasefire could be reached? In which carrots, in which sticks do you think Putin is most responding to, if that's the case?
Sure.
Most likely to respond.
Sure. Well, as you've heard us say in the past, we certainly will continue to support the Ukrainian participation in these talks and conversations, as long as they choose to continue to participate in them, of course. And we are trying to boost them by providing a range of not just economic and humanitarian assistance, but military assistance that we believe strengthens their position in these talks. Our view continues to be that despite words that are said in these talks or coming out of these talks, diplomacy requires engaging in good faith to de-escalate, and what we're really looking for is evidence of that. And we're not seeing any evidence at this point that President Putin is doing anything to stop the onslaught or de-escalate. But that is really what we would be looking for.
Go ahead. Thank you, Jen. To follow up on the Rome meeting, what are the consequences for China if they do aid Russia?
Well, I'm not going to get into specific consequences. I think what we have conveyed and what was conveyed by our national security advisor in this meeting is that should they provide military or other assistance that, of course, violates sanctions or supports the war effort, that there will be significant consequences. But in terms of what those specifics look like, we would coordinate with our partners and allies to make that determination.
Okay. But Jake Sullivan certainly communicated that there would be consequences.
Yes, as we have also said publicly a number of times.
Okay, and then is there anything you can share about the president's potential meeting, potential trip to Europe in the next couple weeks, who he might be meeting with, and really what the point would be going to Europe?
Sure. Well, we are, of course, closely engaged with our NATO partners and European allies, as you've heard us say a number of times, about the next steps in diplomacy, whether that's providing additional humanitarian or security assistance or the mechanics for future conversations. But there's not been any final decision about a trip, so I don't have anything to preview about what that would look like if you were to take a trip.
Thanks, Jen.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. The president said back in February that the U.S. would respond forcefully if Americans were targeted in Ukraine. Brent Renaud was killed over the weekend. One of my colleagues was injured today. We're still waiting to hear if he's okay. So what is that response going to look like?
Well, let me first say, your colleague Benjamin Hall, I know there's not final reports yet, or we would wait for your news organization to confirm those, but our thoughts, the president's thoughts, our administration's thoughts are with him, his family, and all of you at Fox News as well. In terms of specific actions, I think you have seen the president lead the world in putting in place consequences, putting in place repercussions and steps in response to the actions of Russia, the brutal actions that have certainly impacted Ukrainian people and now have certainly impacted some Americans. But in terms of next steps or what the next consequence would be, I don't have anything to preview for you at this point in time.
But we've seen the president been so far unwilling to draw a red line on the kinds of atrocities that we're going to watch from the sidelines. I mean, we've seen maternity wards being bombed, illegal weapons being used, pediatric hospitals being targeted. President Obama drew the red line for Syria at chemical weapons. So is there any thought process about what we're willing to watch happen before
Well, Jackie, I think it's important to reiterate as often as we can that what we're seeing is horrific, what we're seeing is barbaric, and the steps that the president has taken and led the world in taking have essentially led the Russian financial system to be on the brink of collapse. We have provided more military assistance to the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian government than any other country in the world, and more historic assistance than any other year to Ukraine in history. And we're doing that so that we can support them in this difficult moment. So I would say that at this moment in time, we have been hardly on the sidelines. We have been leading this effort around the world to respond to every step and every escalatory step that President Putin and the Russians are taking.
Isn't there a concern that if we don't draw the line at something like chemical weapons, that it'll make it easier for malign actors to use them in the future because they'll just go unpunished?
Well, Jackie, I think that you heard the president say on Friday that there would be severe consequences and the world would respond if they were to use chemical weapons. And what we have been doing over the course of the last several weeks, if not months, is providing as much information to the global community, to the media, and to others about what to expect. And when you have President Putin suggesting and Russian officials suggesting that the United States and Ukrainians are the ones who are working on a chemical weapons program, it's clear that this is a pattern that we have seen in the past of them trying to set up a predicate for their own actions.
But what does that end up looking like if the world responds? Because so far we've heard the president talk a lot about what the U.S. is not going to do in terms of, not wanting to trigger war with a nuclear power. But do we believe that Putin is, a rational kind of person who, would pay attention to something like that? I mean, he didn't need provocation to, invade Ukraine. Why wouldn't we think that he would just create a pretext that is fabricated for something like that?
We do. That's why we've talked about it. And I think, Jackie, what's important here is and then I'm just going to move on to get to more people, is that for any president, you have to weigh how you can lead the world, how you can make very clear that actions are horrific, that they are not acceptable, they're not aligned with global norms, while also thinking about our own national security interests. And starting World War III is certainly not in our national security interests. Putting U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine to fight a war with Russia is not in our national security interests. Go ahead.
Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.